It was a fine afternoon in the village of Little Wytham, the kind of day when sunlight softened the hedgerows, bees hummed between hollyhocks, and the vicar's wife had not a care in the world, at least not until the murder. But such dark thoughts were unthinkable at the start of the annual St. Luke's garden party, an event as fixed in the social calendar as Michaelmas or the Harvest Festival. The party was held on the manicured lawn behind the vicarage, beneath a fluttering banner proclaiming all proceeds to the church roof fund. There were trestle tables laden with sponge cakes and sausage rolls, treacle tarts, and little triangular sandwiches curling slightly at the edges. Children were squealing near the coconut shy, and the women of the village, all in florals, some in pearls, gathered in loose circles to exchange news, compliments, and speculation about who might take home the coveted silver spoon for the best jam. It was the sort of setting in which nothing dramatic could possibly occur, which, of course, made it the ideal place for it to happen. Miss Jane Marple, quietly ensconced in a wicker chair beneath a striped parasol, held a plate of Battenberg cake on her lap and a mild smile on her face. She had observed, without seeming to, nearly every interaction within her range of vision. At the table nearest her, Mrs. Violet Everley, widow of the late Dr. Everley and known to be rather fond of dry sherry and richer widowers, was engaged in lively chatter with Colonel Brackley, recently returned from somewhere vaguely eastern and considerably less trim than he had been during his service years. Nearby, young Lydia Drake, barely 19 and still glowing from her recent engagement to Peter Rowntree, a London solicitor's son with unfortunate ears and an enviable inheritance, accepted compliments with the practiced modesty of someone raised on flattery. "Isn't she blooming?" said Mrs. Weatherby, not unkindly but with a faint sniff. "Though personally, I think Peter's a bit damp." "Money always dries a man out, dear," replied Miss Hartnell, a wiry woman with a fondness for saying things that made people blink. Miss Marple smiled faintly into her teacup. That was precisely the sort of remark that bore remembering. It was just as the judging of the preserves was concluding, a dramatic tie between Mrs. Gillett's damson and the vicar's wife's raspberry, that the first scream rang out. It came not from the coconut shy, nor from the toddler's corner, but from the vicarage itself. A sharp, unmistakably adult scream. Conversation froze, forks hovered in midair, and then came the sound of footsteps, rushed, uneven, heavy, and the cry, "He's dead! Oh, Lord, he's dead!" People were already pushing toward the back steps of the vicarage when Miss Marple, with unassuming swiftness, set down her cake and followed. Inside the vicarage's morning room, sunlit, crisply curtained, and usually smelling of lemon polish, the body of Mr. Harold Sims lay sprawled near the writing desk. Sims had been a solicitor of no great importance but considerable self-regard, a man who had served as treasurer for half the village committees and took great pleasure in being difficult about invoices. He had not looked terribly alive before, but now there was a distinct finality about his appearance. He had fallen backward, his limbs askew, his collar twisted. His eyes stared upward in fixed surprise, and a single teacup, painted china, pink roses, the handle chipped, lay beside his right hand. I brought the tray in for him," said the vicar's wife, pale and shaking. "He said he had a headache and would rather rest. I thought I'd be kind. Oh dear, he didn't even touch the fruitcake." Miss Marple looked gently at her. There, my dear. Quite a shock. But tell me, was that teacup his?" Mrs. Eccles blinked. "Well, of course it was. I brought the usual tray." Miss Marple's eyes remained kindly, but her voice was mild steel. "I don't believe it was. His set has no roses. It has forget-me-nots. I remember quite distinctly, just last Tuesday when I visited, he was very particular about that." In the sudden hush, the words hovered like the scent of lavender polish, calm, unassuming, but deeply out of place. And thus it began. Not with blood on the lawn, nor a gunshot in the dark, but with a teacup that didn't belong on the tray. Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicarage's morning room as the constable from Much Benham arrived to take control of the scene. She was not one to interject where official procedures were concerned, at least not yet. Constable Ridgewell was a pleasant enough young man, earnest and careful, but she suspected he was more used to bicycle theft and stray dogs than sudden deaths over tea. Mr. Sims's body had been removed, and the room, so recently filled with shocked gasps and stammered speculation, had fallen still. The remains of the tea tray sat on the sideboard, as though still awaiting an appreciative guest. There were 2 slices of fruitcake, untouched, a sugar bowl, a milk jug, and 2 teacups. That was the curious part. 2. The constable, notebook in hand, turned to the vicar's wife, who was seated with a lavender-soaked handkerchief pressed to her nose. "Now, Mrs. Eccles, if you could just confirm, you say you brought in the tea tray for Mr. Sims around 3 o'clock? "Yes," she sniffled, just before the judging began. "He'd said he had a headache and needed a quiet lie down. I thought a little tea would do him good. He always took Earl Grey, 1 sugar, just a drop of milk, but..." She shook her head helplessly. "He never even touched it." Miss Marple's eyes flicked once more to the tray. The 2 cups, one with a smear of lipstick on the rim. A detail not yet noticed, it seemed. "Mrs. Eccles," she said gently, "did you drink tea with him yourself?" The vicar's wife blinked. "Goodness, no. I was hardly there a moment. Just put the tray down and left." "Then someone else did," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "Someone who drank from the 2nd cup." Ridgewell paused, pen hovering. "You're quite sure, madam?" Miss Marple only inclined her head. "There's lipstick on that cup. Faint, but it's there. Coral pink, I should say. Not a shade Mr. Sims was likely to favor." The constable moved to examine it more closely and gave a soft exclamation. "Well, I'll be..." "And," she added, almost absent-mindedly, "he never drank fruitcake with tea. Said it sat too heavily. He told me so himself last Christmas." Ridgewell straightened, now visibly more alert. "That's useful to know. Might mean something, or it might not." "Oh, I rather think it does." The constable took the tray into the kitchen for inspection and returned to take statements from the guests. One by one, the villagers relayed their memories of the afternoon, each offering variations on the same scene. Sunshine, small talk, lemon curd, a scream, confusion. But it was Mrs. Violet Everleigh who proved most talkative. She had been among the first to reach the house after the scream and had, by her own description, pushed straight into the morning room, out of instinct, of course. Not curiosity. Heaven forbid. "Poor Harold," she said with dramatic sigh. "I suppose some people will say unkind things, but really, he was quite decent under all that pompousness. Always had a courteous word for me, you know, and always such a stickler for order." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "In what way?" "Oh, everything had to be just so. Spoons facing the same direction. Letters opened with a silver knife. I once watched him rearrange an entire stack of hymnals at the church just because one was a 1/4 inch out of alignment." "I see." Miss Marple made a quiet, mental note. "And did you notice anyone entering the house from the garden before the scream?" Mrs. Everleigh pursed her lips. "Not exactly. But I did see Lydia Drake heading toward the house, just before 3, I believe. She looked rather flustered." "Lydia." Miss Marple's voice remained neutral. "Was she alone?" "As far as I could see. But I wasn't exactly spying, dear. It was just one of those things you glimpse in the corner of your eye." Lydia Drake. The pretty young fiancée with the sweet smile and nervous laugh. Miss Marple remembered how the girl had dropped her glove near the cakes and hastily retrieved it, her hands trembling. Nerves, perhaps, or something more. As the sun dipped lower over Little Wytham, casting long shadows over rose bushes and gravel paths, Miss Marple took her leave of the vicarage. and made her way slowly down the lane. The incident had stirred the village like a spoon in a pot of simmering jam, and already the gossip was beginning to bubble over. At the post office, Miss Hartnell was holding court, one elbow on the counter, her voice lowered to just above a whisper. "I tell you," she said, "it's poison. I heard it from Dr. Graham's assistant, and she heard it from the constable. Something slipped into his tea, most likely. Arsenic, maybe, or cyanide." Miss Marple did not interrupt, but she lingered just long enough to hear Mrs. Weatherby reply, "It's always the quiet ones, I say. You watch. It'll be that Rowntree boy. He's far too polite to be genuine." "I wouldn't be so sure," Miss Hartnell said darkly. "Sims had plenty of enemies. Especially after that business with the land deeds last spring, Miss Marple turned away before they noticed her. Idle speculation had its uses. People often said more than they meant to when they were guessing. But she preferred facts, or at least the bits of behavior that masqueraded as such. The land deeds. She remembered something about that. Sims had refused to approve a transfer for a small parcel of land that the Drakes had hoped to sell to pay off old debts. It had caused a quiet scandal at the time, and though most had forgotten, Miss Marple had not. She found Lydia Drake in the rose arbor behind her family's cottage, seated on a wrought iron bench, hands clenched tightly in her lap. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you look dreadfully pale. May I sit with you a moment?" Lydia glanced up, startled. "Oh, yes, of course." Miss Marple lowered herself onto the bench with a quiet sigh. "Such a lovely garden. I remember when your grandmother planted those climbing roses. She said they were difficult, but worth the trouble. Yes, she loved this place. Your grandmother had a great deal of strength, you know, much like you, I suspect." Lydia gave a small, brittle laugh. "I'm not strong. I feel as though I might break." "Loss has a way of fraying the edges," Miss Marple said, her tone kind. "Were you close to Mr. Sims?" Lydia looked away. "Not particularly. He'd been advising my father on some legal matters. But he always made us feel small, like we were wasting his time. I understand he denied your father's request concerning the sale of land." Lydia's shoulders stiffened. "Yes. He said it was improper, that the deed had a technical clause which required my grandfather's approval, and he's been dead 10 years. It was cruel. He knew we needed the money." "And so, perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "you went to speak to him. One last attempt to persuade him." Lydia turned sharply, her face pale. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I went to the door, yes. I meant to talk to him, but I lost my nerve. I stood outside and then turned back. That's all." I swear Miss Marple reached over and patted the girl's hand. "I believe you, my dear. But someone did go inside. Someone who brought a cup with coral pink lipstick. Someone Mr. Sims trusted enough to sit with privately. And perhaps someone who wanted that fruitcake to be the last thing he ever touched." Lydia stared at her. "You think it was a woman?" "I think," Miss Marple said, rising with a quiet smile, "that people often reveal more by what they leave out than by what they say. And someone brought a teacup that didn't belong on the tray." She paused, glancing toward the village, now settling into dusk, its chimneys whispering smoke into the cooling air. "In Little Witham," she said, almost to herself, "everything is so terribly tidy, until you look beneath the lace." And with that, she walked slowly away, her thoughts already spinning threads of motive, method, and misdirection. The morning following the garden party, Little Witham was a village stirred not only by the lingering scent of roses and freshly brewed tea, but by the relentless hum of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Miss Marple, as ever, moved through the day with the unruffled calm of someone accustomed to both the predictable and the unforeseen. The death of Harold Sims was still the subject of hushed speculation in every household, But for her, the puzzle had only just begun to settle into a form worth unraveling. She made her way first to the vicarage, where Reverend Eccles and his wife were receiving visitors with a graciousness that masked exhaustion. The vicar, a tall man with a lined face that betrayed a kind-hearted soul, welcomed Miss Marple warmly, though his eyes were shadowed with concern. "It's a terrible blow, Jane," he said softly. "I had hoped it was just a fainting spell or something less final. Harold was a pillar of the community for all his faults." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Sometimes the pillars hide cracks, Reverend. I came to ask if you noticed anything unusual yesterday, anything that might have seemed trivial then but seems worth considering now." Reverend Eccles folded his hands on the polished surface of the writing desk. "There was one thing, actually. When Mrs. Everleigh arrived, she seemed unusually agitated, more so than one might expect for a simple garden party." "Agitated? In what way?" She was rather breathless, as though she had been running and kept glancing over her shoulder. When I asked if she was well, she insisted she was quite all right, but then hurried inside. I thought it odd at the time, but I did not press her." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "Did anyone else notice this?" The vicar hesitated. "Not that I know of. Violet Everleigh is a spirited woman, but it was out of character." "I see." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, Reverend. That may prove important." Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple wandered slowly toward the village green. The gossip had spread like wildfire. Shopkeepers and postmistresses were discussing the tragedy with a mixture of curiosity and fear. It was at the village shop that she encountered Mrs. Weatherby again, who was busily folding a woolen scarf around her neck despite the mild weather. "Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful?" she said, lowering her voice. "I hear the coroner suspects foul play. They say Mr. Sims died from poison. Arsenic, perhaps." "Yes," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "I gathered as much. Poison is a silent, insidious method, one that leaves few traces but many questions." Mrs. Weatherby leaned in, her eyes wide. "And there's talk that Mr. Rowntree had a quarrel with Sims not long ago. Some say over money, some say over Lydia." Miss Marple allowed herself a small nod. "I've heard that too, yet it is rarely as simple as it seems." Her thoughts drifted back to Lydia Drake's pale face, the tremor in her hands, and the way she had confessed to standing outside Sims's door but not entering. Was it fear, guilt, or something else entirely? At the village pub, Miss Marple found Colonel Brackley nursing a glass of sherry. The colonel was a tall man with a military bearing that had not softened with age, his keen eyes scanning the room as though looking for threats invisible to others. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a nod. "I hear the village is quite unsettled." "Yes, Colonel. I'm afraid the peace has been shattered." He gestured toward the fireplace. "May I offer you a seat?" As they settled into the worn leather chairs, Miss Marple broached the subject gently. "Colonel, you were at the garden party, I believe." "Yes, of course. I've known Harold Sims for years, an obstinate man, but reliable in his own way." "Did you notice anything unusual during the party? Any interactions that struck you as odd?" The colonel considered. "Well, now that you mention it, I did see Mrs. Everleigh speaking with Mr. Sims near the rose bushes. They seemed to be in some sort of disagreement. Violet's temper can be fiery when roused." "And did it seem serious?" "Difficult to say. They were lowered voices, but Mrs. Everleigh's face was flushed, and she gestured sharply with her hand. I thought perhaps they were arguing about the raffle or some village matter." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thank you. Every detail helps." As the colonel left, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the empty chair at the corner table where Peter Rowntree had been seen speaking with several villagers earlier in the day. He was nowhere to be found now, but the impression lingered. A young man under pressure, caught between loyalty to his fiancée and the undercurrents of resentment that swirled around. Mr. Sims. Back at her own cottage, Miss Marple sat with a cup of tea, turning over the threads she had gathered. The mismatched teacup, the lipstick, the quarrels, the secret visits. Each was a thread in a tapestry that was not yet clear but was beginning to show its outline. The postman's arrival brought a letter, addressed in a delicate, looping hand. It was from Lydia Drake, and inside was a hastily scrawled note asking if she might speak with Miss Marple privately. The girl's desperation was palpable even in the brief lines. Later that afternoon, Lydia arrived, her composure more steady than before, but no less anxious. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, settling into the chair opposite Miss Marple. "Of course, my dear. What troubles you?" Lydia bit her lip. I left something out yesterday, something I should have said." Miss Marple leaned forward, encouraging. "Go on." "It's about the teacup, the one with the lipstick. I saw someone put it on the tray." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Who?" "It was Mrs. Everleigh. I didn't want to say before because she frightens me. She's so confident, so sure of herself, but I saw her bring a small tray into the room when the others were distracted." "And did Mr. Sims see her?" Lydia hesitated. "I don't know. I left just after she came in." Miss Marple steepled her fingers. "Mrs. Everleigh seems to be at the center of many of these quiet ripples." Lydia nodded. "Yes, and there's more. Last week, Mrs. Everleigh told me she needed to speak with my father about the land again. She said she had new information, but she never did." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "That could mean a great deal." As Lydia left, Miss Marple felt the weight of the village's tangled secrets pressing in. She knew the surface politeness hid something darker, resentments carefully veiled, debts unpaid, alliances fragile as spun glass. That evening, she attended a meeting with Constable Ridgewell and Reverend Eccles to review what was known so far. The constable presented the coroner's report. Death by poison, no sign of forced entry, and the mysterious presence of a second teacup. "Poison means planning," Miss Marple mused. "An act committed by someone who knew their victim well and had the means to get close." Ridgewell nodded. "But who? And why?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That, dear constable, is the question we must answer, and it will require patience, observation, and the willingness to listen to what people do not say." As the night deepened and the village lights flickered through the mist, Miss Marple settled by her fire with a notebook, ready to chart the complex dance of motives, disguises, and truths waiting to be uncovered. In Little Wytham, appearances were precious currency, and she was determined to discover who had spent theirs most recklessly. The teacup that did not belong was only the beginning. Miss Marple awoke the next morning with the faint outline of an idea forming, still too soft to articulate but insistent enough to shape her actions. The revelations from Lydia had shifted the weight of suspicion like a tide pulling away from the obvious suspects and toward more shadowed shores. Violet Everleigh was quickly becoming a figure of intrigue, not because she was outspoken or dramatic, but because too many threads led back to her. Outside, the day had dawned crisp and clear, with dew still clinging to the grass as she stepped from her cottage. A fine morning to visit the Women's Institute, where the village's pulse could always be felt more acutely than in any police file or formal interview. The ladies of Little Wytham, gathered under the pretext of preparing for the upcoming autumn fair, were hard at work preserving jam, hemming bunting, and, most importantly, talking. Miss Marple entered quietly and was greeted with smiles and polite greetings. She took her seat near the window and, with deliberate effort, began stitching a T, cozy as if her mind were nowhere but on the evenness of her cross stitches. But her ears, keen as ever, picked out voices weaving behind the clatter of spoons and rustle of fabric. Never trusted her, that Violet. "Too many airs and graces for someone who only married into a bit of money," said one woman, her voice low but vibrant with glee. She was pacing near the rose trellis before the party. Another chimed in. I thought she'd worn a hole in the grass. She's not been right since that business with her sister's will, murmured a third, a trace of knowing tension in her voice. Miss Marple's eyes flicked briefly upward. That was new. Violet Everleigh's sister. There had been no mention of family in any of her conversations so far, and yet even a casual reference to a disputed inheritance had the tang of motive to it. Excuse me, Daphne, she said gently, addressing the woman who had spoken. Did I hear something about Mrs. Everleigh's sister? Daphne was only too happy to elaborate, clearly flattered by Miss Marple's attention. Oh yes, her sister, Margaret, died just over a year ago. Some sort of illness, quite sudden. There was a bit of unpleasantness over the will. Margaret had no children, and the house in Devon was expected to go to Violet. But instead, it went to a cousin, caused quite a stir. I see, Miss Marple said softly. And Mrs. Everleigh didn't contest it? Not formally, but she was bitter. Still is, I should think. The cousin, a man named Dennis Colby, was a surprise to everyone. Barely knew Margaret. Curious, Miss Marple said with the faintest of smiles. One never quite knows what secrets a family tree might hide. By midday, she had excused herself and was on her way to the library, where old parish records and newspaper clippings were kept in bound ledgers, dusty but meticulously maintained by the local historian. Mr. Farthing, a bespectacled man with a mind like an index card file, welcomed her with a solemn nod. Looking for anything in particular, Miss Marple? Just a bit of family research, she replied, her voice mild. The Everleighs, if you happen to have anything. Especially any mention of Violet's late sister, Margaret. He returned some 20 minutes later with 2 volumes and an envelope. These cover the local notices from Devon, where the Everleighs originated. Margaret Simcox, that was her maiden name. She married a gentleman in the military, but he died young. She went back to her family's estate shortly after. The envelope contained a photograph, yellowed at the corners. It showed 2 women, Margaret and Violet, unmistakably sisters, though Margaret's smile seemed less guarded, her posture looser. Written on the back was a note, Easter, 1947, at the orchard before the disagreement. The disagreement? Miss Marple inquired. Farthing adjusted his glasses. Not much is known, only that the sisters stopped speaking for a time. Some say it was about money. Others suggest it had something to do with a man. Quite often, Miss Marple murmured. Those 2 things are one and the same. She spent the rest of the hour poring over the pages, noting a pattern. Margaret's name vanished from the social pages not long before her death. There were whispers of illness, but no doctor's confirmation and no mention of the cousin, Dennis Colby, until the will was executed. As she stepped out into the fading light of the afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the police station. Constable Ridgewell looked up from his desk, eyebrows lifting. I thought you might be by, he said. Something new? I've been thinking about Mrs. Everleigh, she said gently. Have you confirmed her whereabouts during the hours leading up to Mr. Sims's death? Ridgewell frowned. She claims she was in the garden most of the time. Said she stepped indoors briefly to find the raffle tickets. But no one can confirm that. Not directly, no. Though Mr. Prowse says he saw her near the dining room. Says she looked startled to see him. Interesting, Miss Marple said, because young Lydia Drake saw her place a teacup on the tray. A teacup that didn't match the others. And now I find mention of a disputed inheritance. Her sister died rather conveniently, it seems. Ridgewell leaned forward. You think Mrs. Everleigh is behind this? I think, Miss Marple said softly, that Mrs. Everleigh is someone accustomed to winning. And when she loses, she finds a way to make it right, by her own sense of justice. The constable nodded, the gravity settling in. I'll make inquiries about the sister's death. Quietly. As she left, Miss Marple passed Peter Rowntree heading toward the bakery. He looked drawn, as if he had not slept well. Impulsively, she called to him. "Peter, may I walk with you?" He hesitated, then nodded. As they strolled, she asked gently, "You and Lydia, things are not easy, are they?" He shook his head. "She's different since Harold died. Nervous. I don't know what to do." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said, "the best thing you can do is listen to what frightens a person, rather than trying to fix it." Peter looked at her, eyes clouded. "Do you think she's in danger?" "I think," she said carefully, "that whoever killed Harold Sims did not do it in a moment of passion. They did it because something very old and very personal, was threatened." Peter stopped in his tracks. "You think it wasn't about Lydia at all?" "I think Lydia may have been a distraction, or worse, a convenient scapegoat." She parted from him near the post office, leaving him with more questions than answers, but also, perhaps, with a deeper resolve to protect the woman he loved. That evening, as dusk pressed against the windows of her cottage, Miss Marple took out the photograph again. Margaret and Violet, smiling once. Easter, 1947. Before the disagreement. What disagreement could fracture a bond so tightly wound? What secret had simmered beneath the surface long enough to kill, more than once if need be? And what part, if any, had Harold Sims played in unearthing it? The pieces were still scattered, but the outline was emerging. The teacup, the sister, the will, the quarrelsome visit to Sims's study. Someone had come to silence the past, and Miss Marple, with the quiet certainty of one who had seen it all before, knew that past would never stay buried for long. The next morning brought a soft drizzle, the sort that seemed to seep quietly into the bones and encourage contemplation. Miss Marple, wrapped in her dove-grey shawl, sat beside her modest fire, teacup balanced on her knee and the photograph of Violet and Margaret resting on the small table beside her. She had looked at it several times now, but each time a different detail emerged. The way Violet's hand was clenched at her side, while her sister leaned, smiling, just slightly away from her. Attention disguised as affection. There was one name Miss Marple had not yet heard from Violet's lips. Dennis Colby, the cousin who had inherited Margaret's estate. If Violet had felt slighted, betrayed even, it was odd she had not spoken of him, unless she had her reasons for leaving him out. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Constable Ridgewell stood on the other side, rain speckling his cap. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple." "Not at all," she said warmly, stepping aside to let him in. "Do come in out of the rain." "I've made a few discreet inquiries," Ridgewell said as he removed his damp coat, "about Margaret Simcox's death. There was no autopsy. The cause of death was recorded as myocardial infarction, heart failure. The attending physician signed it without question." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "And the physician, had he known Margaret long?" "Not particularly. He was a temporary locum at the time, filling in for her usual doctor. By all accounts, she died peacefully in her sleep. No fuss. No signs of struggle or distress." "No fuss," Miss Marple echoed softly. "How very neat. There's something else. That cousin, Dennis Colby, he's not as distant a relation as people believe. His mother was Margaret and Violet's aunt. It seems he and Margaret corresponded for years, though quietly. Violet may not have known how close they'd grown. That would explain her shock at the will." Miss Marple looked up, her gaze clear. "And perhaps her bitterness. Have you looked into Mr. Colby himself? He lives in Bath, owns a modest bookshop, keeps to himself. From what I can gather, he was fond of Margaret, but they never saw each other often. Just letters." Miss Marple nodded. "It's always the letters that hold the truth. The spoken word can be twisted, but people often reveal themselves in ink." Ridgewell leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. I've asked to see any remaining correspondence from Margaret's estate. If Colby kept her letters, we might find something useful." "You're doing very well, Constable," she said kindly. "I suspect that we're not dealing with impulse or madness, but cold, long-standing calculation." Later that day, Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage, where a number of villagers had gathered for an informal afternoon tea. These small gatherings had become more frequent since the murder, as if people needed reassurance that life continued. The vicar's wife, a gentle woman named Rosalind with a talent for scones and calming nervous chatter, welcomed her at once. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said with genuine warmth, "come sit by the window. It's the best spot for a view of the garden." Miss Marple took her seat, tea in hand, and turned her attention quietly to the conversation unfurling around her. "I'm telling you, Harold Sims had enemies," said old Mr. Langham. "No one likes a man who keeps people's secrets for a living." "I heard he was about to publish something," whispered Mavis Appleton, a narrow-faced woman whose voice always suggested a secret too large for her to carry. "Something scandalous." "Now, Mavis," Rosalind interjected mildly, "surely that's just village talk." But Miss Marple perked up. "Publish something, you say? Did Harold write?" "He kept notes, apparently. On all sorts of things. Old gossip, property disputes, scandals, even a few stories, I think." "Fiction?" Miss Marple asked. "Some of it, yes. But some... well, that's what people are saying. Some of it was a thin veil over real events." Miss Marple's mind moved quickly. If Harold Sims had begun writing down village secrets, even cloaked in fiction, it might explain why someone had acted so decisively. Especially if one of those stories hinted at something damning. Something about Margaret's death, perhaps, or a motive long buried. After tea, she walked slowly down the gravel lane toward the Sims residence. The constable had already given her quiet leave to enter, provided she disturbed nothing. The house had remained largely untouched, its contents sealed until the investigation concluded. Inside, the atmosphere was eerily still. The air retained that faint scent of dried flowers and paper. Miss Marple moved through the sitting room and into the study, her eyes drawn to the writing desk. In one of the drawers, neatly filed, were several folders of typescript pages. She selected one at random. It was a story, lightly fictionalized, but the characters were unmistakable. A village matriarch and her forgotten sister, a house in Devon, a disputed will, and a veiled suggestion the elder sister had fallen ill shortly after drinking a restorative tea prepared by her sibling. Miss Marple closed the folder gently. It wasn't an accusation, but it was enough to cause concern if anyone recognized themselves in the tale. She searched the drawer further and found a thin envelope addressed in Harold's bold script to D.C. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single page, typed, "Dear Cousin Dennis. As promised, I've written the first piece. Your aunt's story is quite compelling, and I've done my best to preserve the ambiguity while keeping the emotional truth. I'm titling it The House on the Hill. Let me know what you think. I've more to come. One in particular may be of special interest to you." H.S. Miss Marple folded the letter and replaced it, her mind racing. If Dennis Colby had received that letter, then he knew Harold was writing about Margaret. And if Violet found out, she would have seen it as a threat, not just to her pride or her reputation, but to her very freedom. It was nearly dusk when she stepped outside. The sky had darkened with cloud, and the soft patter of rain resumed. But the direction of the case was suddenly clearer. Violet, knowing Harold had written something damning, may have sought to retrieve or destroy it. But someone else, perhaps Lydia, perhaps even Colby himself, might also have come searching. As she turned the corner toward the green, she spotted Lydia walking briskly, her coat drawn tight and her head bowed against the wind. Miss Marple caught up with her gently. "My dear," she said kindly, "may I walk with you?" Lydia glanced at her, surprised, but nodded. "I've just come from Harold's study," Miss Marple said. "He was writing stories, it seems." Lydia stopped. "I know. You do. I found one, the morning after he died. I shouldn't have gone in, but I thought if I could find something to explain why." "And did you?" Lydia's eyes clouded. "I found the story about Violet's sister, and another, one he hadn't finished. It was about someone putting something in a cup of tea. Did you show it to anyone?" "Number Y burned it," she said. "I was afraid. I thought people would think it was me." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You were trying to protect yourself, but sometimes in protecting ourselves, we destroy the very thing that could save us." They walked on in silence. Miss Marple now had little doubt. Violet had motive, opportunity, and the necessary cunning, but proving it would require more than intuition. It would require drawing her out, making her feel cornered, letting her speak for herself. Because the truth, Miss Marple had learned time and again, had a way of slipping from the lips of the guilty when they felt most secure. The following morning unfolded with a deceptive calm. Birds chattered cheerfully in the hedgerows, and the village of Little Witham resumed its quiet rhythm. But beneath the surface, a current of tension pulsed steadily. Word had begun to trickle out that Harold Sims had been writing about the villagers. Stories, yes, but stories with teeth, stories that might wound. Miss Marple rose early, stirred by a sense that the puzzle, so long a cloudy tangle, was beginning to take shape. There was still one person she needed to speak with, someone curiously absent from much of the recent discussion, yet close enough to have insight no one else could. She found Nathaniel Prowse in his greenhouse, tending to a row of late chrysanthemums. The scent of damp earth and delicate blossoms filled the air. "I didn't expect company, Miss Marple," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. His tone was polite but guarded. "You've been most helpful throughout this dreadful affair," she began, her voice warm and unthreatening. "But there's something I must ask. About Violet Everly." He hesitated only a second. "What about her? You said you saw her near the dining room the afternoon of the garden party, that she seemed startled to see you." "I did," he said slowly. "She was flustered. I thought perhaps she'd lost something. But she didn't mention it. Number just hurried off. I assumed she didn't want to be bothered. Violet can be private." "She can indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Did you happen to see her again, nearer the time Mr. Sims was found?" Prowse shook his head. "Number I was speaking with Mrs. Dawlish about the flower arrangements then, but what, Mr. Prowse?" He frowned, thoughtful. "Now that I think of it, the tea tray, it was there, on the sideboard when I passed by. I remember because the cups were all in pairs. White porcelain, same pattern, except one." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Yes? One had a different handle, looked older, more ornate, didn't match the others." "And did you see anyone touch it?" "No, but when I returned later, after they'd found Harold, it was gone." Miss Marple nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling behind her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Prowse. You've helped more than you know." She returned to her cottage and sat at her writing desk, thinking carefully. Harold had prepared tea for the guests, but someone had swapped a cup, perhaps before the tray was carried out. A single, mismatched teacup, likely prepared separately. No one noticed in the bustle of the gathering, but Harold drank from it and died. If Violet had prepared the cup herself, she'd done so out of sight. But if someone else had, or had seen her do it, the risk of discovery remained. And that was when the story Harold had written became the lever. If Violet suspected that Harold knew about Margaret's death, had perhaps hinted at it in fiction, then the need to silence him became imperative. But Miss Marple still lacked proof. Violet had not confessed, nor had she made a mistake. And the teacup, the crucial evidence, had vanished. Or had it? Miss Marple paid a visit to Constable Ridgewell just after noon, explaining what Mr. Prowse had seen. "That's the same cup Lydia mentioned," Ridgewell said. "The odd one out, but it wasn't in the kitchen afterward. We searched." "It might not have gone back to the kitchen," Miss Marple said. "It might never have left the house at all." She suggested they return to the Sims residence and examine the sideboard and nearby cupboards with fresh eyes. This time, Ridgewell brought a younger constable with him, a lad with slim fingers and an eye for detail. They searched quietly, methodically. Miss Marple watched them, her gaze steady, as Ridgewell opened one cabinet after another. In the bottom cupboard, beneath the sideboard, behind a stack of old serving platters, the young constable found a shallow box covered with a tea towel. Inside was a single teacup, ivory with a painted rose motif, ornate, slightly chipped on the rim. Ridgewell let out a low whistle. "Well now, there's our ghost cup." It was sent immediately for chemical testing, but even before the results returned, Miss Marple felt the balance shift. The concealment of the teacup wasn't an accident. Someone had hidden it, likely in the panic following the discovery of Harold's body. That evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the Everleigh house. Violet answered the door herself, poised as ever, though there was a new tightness in her smile. "Miss Marple, what a surprise." "I was passing by," she lied gently, "and I wondered how you were holding up." Violet ushered her into the drawing room and poured them both a cup of tea. Miss Marple sipped it politely, then set her cup down with deliberate care. "I've been thinking about Margaret," she said softly. "What a tragedy, her passing." Violet's gaze sharpened. "Yes, a loss. You were close, I imagine." "Not particularly." Her tone was cool. "We were different." "So I gathered. Still, it must have been painful when the estate went to your cousin." Violet stiffened. "It was her decision. I don't speak of it." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "I believe Harold Sims had begun to write about it." A flicker passed across Violet's face. "He fancied himself a writer, but he had no right to drag my family into his stories." "No one enjoys being exposed," Miss Marple said gently. "But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when we work very hard to keep it buried." Violet stood abruptly. "I don't see what this has to do with anything." Miss Marple rose as well, her expression unreadable. "Only that someone went to great lengths to hide a teacup, a very particular cup. I imagined it had something quite disagreeable in it. Something that would explain how a man could die so suddenly without a mark on him." Violet didn't answer. Her hands had closed tightly over the back of a chair. Miss Marple gave her a moment, then added quietly, "When people feel they've been wronged, they sometimes convince themselves they are entitled to justice, even if it means becoming judge, jury, and executioner." The room hung silent for several beats. Then Violet spoke, her voice low and deliberate. "He was going to publish it, wasn't he? That story." "I believe so. He never understood discretion, not even in fiction. Margaret trusted someone she shouldn't have. She told me once. And when she realized the truth, she despaired." "What truth?" Miss Marple asked softly. Violet looked away. "It was Colby. Dennis. He manipulated her, befriended her for years, then turned her against me. Made her believe I was after her money. She changed her will, cut me out. Surely that wasn't enough to make you. She died of grief. You may not believe that, but I do." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "And now Harold, he would have twisted it into entertainment. He had no right. So you silenced him?" Violet didn't reply, but her shoulders sagged. "I didn't plan it that day," she said eventually. "I only wanted to take the pages, to find out what he had written, but then I saw the cup, the one with the chip. I thought, if I just added a little something." Miss Marple waited. "It was an old sedative, from years ago. I didn't mean to kill him, just make him ill. Make him delay the publication, but he must have had a weak heart. And the cup. I panicked. I couldn't take it with me. I hid it in the cabinet, thinking I'd return for it. But then everything happened so fast. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping softly against the windows. Miss Marple stood still. "I believe you didn't intend for him to die," she said gently. "But intention matters little now. Harold Sims is dead, and the truth, no matter how painful, will come out." Violet's silence was her only answer, but it was enough. That night, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, the teacup retrieved, the confession made. It was not satisfaction she felt, but the melancholy certainty that justice, when it arrived, often brought with it as much sorrow as relief. The confession had been quietly monumental, yet Miss Marple knew the surface was only just broken. Violet Everleigh's admission, laden with regret and a complicated mix of guilt and justification, formed a fragile thread that could unravel much more than just the mystery of Harold Sims's sudden death. There were still pieces missing, shadows clinging to corners of the village that the keenest eyes had yet to illuminate. Miss Marple spent the next day weaving carefully through her thoughts and the village's routine, her presence subtle but persistent. She observed the way Violet moved about her home, the delicate way she touched the faded lace curtains, the brief moments her eyes flickered toward the sideboard where the teacup had once rested. It was clear the weight of her actions bore heavily, but there was a resilience too, a shield forged from years of defending herself against whispered suspicions and veiled accusations. The village, meanwhile, was restless. Gossip, once a steady hum, was growing louder, its melody punctuated by sharper, more discordant notes. At the vicarage tea, voices flitted nervously between curiosity and condemnation. Some villagers clung to the hope of Violet's innocence. Others whispered darkly of greed and desperation. It was, as always, a tangled web of truth, half-truths, and outright fabrications. Miss Marple's thoughts returned often to Dennis Colby. He was a distant figure, one who had wielded unexpected influence over Margaret and, by extension, over the Everleigh sisters. Yet he had remained in the background, like a shadow cast by the flickering light of the village's shared secrets. She resolved to bring him into her quiet examination of motives and opportunity. A letter was dispatched, courteous and precise, inviting Mr. Colby to Little Wytham under the pretense of discussing the estate's unsettled matters. The reply came swiftly. He would arrive by the afternoon train, a thin man with gentle eyes, whose quiet demeanor masked a certain wariness. When Dennis Colby appeared on the village platform, Miss Marple greeted him with a steady smile and a careful warmth. His manner was polite, his speech measured, but there was an undercurrent of tension that suggested he too bore scars beneath his calm exterior. They walked slowly toward the Everleigh house, the muted patter of rain softening their footsteps. Miss Marple led with the gentleness of one who knows that the smallest details may unlock the greatest truths. "Mr. Colby," she began, "I imagine this has been a difficult time." He nodded, his gaze distant. "It has. Margaret was more than a cousin. She was a friend. I never wished to cause her harm. Yet there was discord," Miss Marple said softly. "You and Violet had differences?" Dennis sighed, a sound like wind stirring dead leaves. "Yes. Violet felt I had usurped her place. It's true I encouraged Margaret to reconsider the will, but it was because I believed Violet would squander the estate. Did you ever suspect she might go to desperate lengths to prevent that?" "No," he said firmly. "But I see now I underestimated the weight of old grievances." Miss Marple's eyes held his. Old grievances have a curious way of festering. Dennis hesitated, then added, "I did visit the Everleigh house the day Harold died." Miss Marple inclined her head. "You did?" "I wished to speak with Violet, to calm things if I could, but I found her agitated, and she would not see me." "And the teacup?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Dennis's expression faltered. I noticed it, the one out of place. She told me later it was a family heirloom. She said she meant no harm, but I suspect she was hiding something. Miss Marple's thoughts spun a subtle web. The heirloom cup, a cherished vessel now stained with the memory of death, symbolized much more than its delicate porcelain. It was a touchstone of family pride, betrayal, and the desperate hope to control fate's cruel hand. As they spoke, Miss Marple's keen gaze caught a faint tremor in Dennis's hands. "Have you been unwell?" He smiled faintly. "The past weeks have taken their toll, but nothing serious." Yet Miss Marple suspected that beneath the surface, tension stretched thin and truths strained toward breaking. Later, in the quiet solitude of her cottage, Miss Marple arranged the threads of the day's revelations. The confession from Violet, Dennis's unexpected visit, the hidden stories of Harold's manuscripts. Each element was a step closer to understanding the full picture, but there remained a puzzle piece still out of place. Her thoughts returned to Lydia Dawlish, who had burned one of Harold's manuscripts in fear, perhaps unknowingly destroying evidence vital to unveiling the whole truth. Miss Marple knew Lydia's loyalty and fear were intertwined with more than mere happenstance. She resolved to visit Lydia again, this time with a different approach, gentle probing rather than questioning. People like Lydia, who carried their secrets beneath layers of protective affection, could sometimes be led to reveal what the past had locked away. The afternoon sun broke through clouds as Miss Marple reached Lydia's cottage. The garden was a riot of late blooms, but the woman herself was subdued, the sparkle in her eyes dimmed. "Lydia," Miss Marple greeted softly, "I wonder if we might speak again. There are things that need understanding, and you may hold the key." Lydia hesitated but nodded. "I want to help, Miss Marple. I truly do." They sat together over tea, the air thick with unspoken fears. Miss Marple spoke with the quiet patience that had unmasked many a hidden truth before. "Harold's writings frightened you, didn't they?" "Yes," Lydia whispered. "He knew too much. He was going to publish more, things that would shame people, things that I thought might destroy us all. Did you ever think of telling Violet or anyone else?" "No," Lydia said, shaking her head. "I was afraid of what they might do if they knew how much he knew. And the night Harold died." Lydia's hands trembled. "I stayed up late, reading. I heard voices downstairs, Violet and Mr. Prowse arguing. I didn't want to listen, but I couldn't help myself." Miss Marple leaned forward. "What did you hear?" "I heard Violet say she had to stop Harold, that if he published, everything would be lost. Then the cups were mentioned, and a plan." Miss Marple held her breath, allowing Lydia's words to settle like stones into the growing mosaic of truth. "I didn't see what happened next," Lydia continued, "but I heard a crash, then silence." Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly. Lydia's testimony placed her close to the moment of the crime, a witness to the tension, but unable to intervene. It explained why she had hidden certain facts, fearful of becoming implicated. This new information cast a sharper light on Violet's desperation and the silent struggle unfolding beneath the polite veneer of Little Witham's village life. As twilight deepened, Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky streaked with pink and gray, her thoughts a swirl of human frailty and resolve. The pieces were clicking together, but the full image remained just out of reach. The true killer had shown restraint and cunning, but there was a reckoning still to come. For in the quiet corners of Little Witham, secrets that had once been buried were now rising, and Miss Marple, with her subtle yet inexorable wisdom, was ready to face them all. The village of Little Witham had settled into an uneasy quiet, the sort of silence that seemed to wait with bated breath for something inevitable to unfold. Miss Marple, however, was far from idle. She knew the moment had arrived to test her final theory, to gently prod at the fragile facades until the truth emerged from the shadows with unyielding clarity. Her plan was subtle but deliberate. Rather than confront Violet Everly outright, she would engage her in a conversation designed to reveal the cracks beneath her composed exterior, those fleeting reactions and involuntary gestures that spoke volumes to a keen observer. Late that afternoon, Miss Marple arranged a visit under the pretext of discussing the ongoing legal complications of the Everly estate. Violet greeted her with a cautious smile, as though bracing for yet another inquisition. But Miss Marple's approach was different. Warm, inviting, almost conversational. As they settled in the drawing room, Miss Marple began to speak of the estate's future, of the burdens Violet now carried, and the ways the past had shaped the present. Her voice was gentle, weaving stories of loss and regret that mirrored Violet's own. "Sometimes, Violet," Miss Marple said, "we carry more than our share of sorrow. It's the quiet griefs, those untold and unseen, that often do the most damage." Violet's eyes flickered briefly, a shadow crossing her features before she masked it with a delicate nod. "I understand," Violet replied softly. "It has been difficult." Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch, then gently shifted the conversation. "You mentioned before that you did not intend to harm Harold Sims, that the teacup was meant only to delay him. But of course, things did not go as planned." Violet's fingers tightened on the edge of her chair. "Number Rye only wanted to protect what was left of my family's dignity." "Protecting one's dignity can sometimes lead to unintended consequences," Miss Marple murmured. "But what puzzles me is this. If you wished only to delay Harold, why hide the cup so thoroughly? And why not tell someone? Confide in a friend, perhaps?" Violet hesitated, then her defenses slipped for just a moment. "Fear," she whispered. "Fear that no one would understand, that they would condemn me." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Fear can be a powerful motivator, but it can also cloud judgment. You must understand, Violet, that in this village, people see more than they say. They notice the smallest details, even the teacup." Violet's breath caught, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of panic, just for an instant, before she composed herself. "It's a terrible burden," Violet said quietly, "but I will face whatever comes." Miss Marple nodded, the last piece of her quiet puzzle clicking into place. "Thank you for your honesty. It is often the truth, spoken softly and reluctantly, that holds the greatest power." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Constable Ridgewell, looking slightly flushed from his brisk walk. "Miss Everly," he said, "the test results on the teacup have arrived." A heavy silence settled over the room as he handed the envelope to Miss Marple. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the document. The chemical analysis revealed the presence of a rare sedative in the tea residue, exactly the substance Violet had described. It was potent enough to cause heart failure in a vulnerable individual like Harold Sims, especially one with known health issues. Miss Marple folded the paper thoughtfully. "This confirms what we suspected, Violet. The cup was indeed poisoned, though not with malice, but with desperation." Violet's hands shook slightly as she reached for her own tea, now forgotten and cooling in its delicate cup. "It was never meant to be permanent," she whispered. "Just a delay." Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand over Violet's. "Intentions do matter, but so do actions. The law will decide what must follow. But there is something else. Something that has troubled me throughout." She looked steadily into Violet's eyes. "The story," Harold wrote. "You said he had no right to expose your family's pain. But why did you never try to stop him before it was too late?" Violet's breath hitched. "I was afraid. If I confronted him, it might have made him more determined." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Sometimes, silence is the loudest confession of all." The conversation ended with a shared, sorrowful understanding. Violet, for all her faults and fears, was not a villain but a woman broken by circumstance, making tragic choices in the shadow of grief and betrayal. Later that evening, Miss Marple convened with Constable Ridgewell and a small gathering of the village's elders to outline the revelations. The truth was clear now. Violet Everleigh had poisoned Harold Sims, albeit unintentionally, driven by fear of exposure and the collapse of a family legacy. The police would take Violet into custody, but the village's collective mood was one of somber reflection rather than triumph. Little Wytham had been shaken to its core, not just by a murder, but by the fragile threads of human frailty that connected them all. As the assembly dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the hearth, her thoughts turning inward. She reflected on the quiet tragedies that so often hid behind polite smiles and measured words, the whispered resentments, the years of unspoken pain. In Little Wytham, peace would eventually return, but not without an enduring shadow. For Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface of every village lay secrets waiting to surface, and the delicate balance between justice and mercy was as fragile as the teacup that had started it all. The village of Little Wytham seemed to hold its breath in the days following Violet Everleigh's confession and the subsequent arrest. The usual rhythms, shopkeepers arranging their wares, children darting between hedgerows, the clink of teacups in cozy parlors, continued, yet there was an unspoken tension woven through the air, as if every glance carried the weight of a secret now laid bare. Miss Marple, ever observant and quietly resolute, resumed her daily walks, her steps slow but purposeful along the winding lanes that stitched the village together. She noted the subtle shifts. Mrs. Pettigrew no longer perched at her window with the same eager gossip. The vicar's sermons touched on forgiveness with an unusual urgency, and the younger villagers whispered in hushed tones at the market square, their conversations guarded. Despite the outward calm, the ripples of Violet's actions had unsettled more than just the surface. The fragile social tapestry of Little Wytham had been tugged at, and the threads revealed under close scrutiny were not entirely smooth. Miss Marple's thoughts returned often to the destroyed manuscript, Harold Sims' final work, said to contain revelations potent enough to tarnish reputations and fracture relationships. The manuscript had vanished in the flames of Lydia Dawlish's hearth, but its echoes remained, threading through the testimonies and veiled confessions she had gathered. One afternoon, seated by the window with a steaming cup of tea, Miss Marple was joined by Constable Ridgewell, who brought news that had quietly stirred a fresh undercurrent in the village. A packet had been found, left anonymously at the post office, addressed to Miss Marple herself. Inside were several pages of typed manuscript, fragments of Harold's lost work, carefully preserved and hidden. As Miss Marple read the pages, her expression deepened. The text spoke of old grievances and betrayals, far beyond what had been revealed, hinting at relationships marred by jealousy and long-buried resentments that had simmered beneath Little Wytham's genteel surface for decades. It suggested that Harold had intended to expose more than Violet's family secrets. There were names and stories that could shake the village to its core once fully known. She showed the fragments to Ridgewell, who shared a quiet concern. This changes things, doesn't it? Perhaps there's more to this story than even Violet's desperation. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, Constable. Violet's actions, while tragic, were but a single thread in a much larger tapestry. Harold's writings threatened to unravel more than just one family. The discovery prompted Miss Marple to revisit those she had spoken to watch and listen anew. She paid particular attention to Lydia Dawlish, whose earlier fear-driven destruction of the manuscript had concealed far more than she realized. In their conversations, Lydia revealed her growing dread as Harold's revelations loomed closer to daylight. Fear not only for herself, but for the village as a whole. There are things we all thought best kept buried, Lydia confessed. Some stories, Miss Marple, can bring ruin. Miss Marple, with gentle persistence, encouraged Lydia to speak of those stories, not with accusation, but understanding. Slowly, Lydia spoke of bitter rivalries, failed romances, and whispered alliances, human dramas layered with pain and pride, each contributing to the village's quiet history of secrets. As Miss Marple pieced together these fragments, she understood that the murder was not merely a desperate act, but the climax of decades of hidden discord. Harold Sims, with his pen sharp as any dagger, had threatened to expose a past some wished to remain forever hidden. Meanwhile, Violet Everleigh's trial approached, and the village found itself divided between sympathy and judgment. Many saw Violet as a tragic figure, a woman overwhelmed by fear and loyalty, while others regarded her as culpable, a reminder of the darker side beneath the village's charming veneer. Miss Marple attended the trial, her presence unobtrusive but attentive. The courtroom drama unfolded with all the human complexities she had anticipated. Denials, justifications, and emotional pleas that echoed the very essence of the village's tangled history. When the verdict came, Violet was found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, a decision that reflected the court's recognition of her intent and circumstances. Sentenced to a term in a women's prison, Violet accepted her fate with a quiet dignity that touched even the hardest hearts. In the days that followed, little Wytham began the slow process of healing, though some scars remained. Miss Marple, ever reflective, understood that the village's peace was a delicate balance, one maintained not by forgetting, but by acknowledging the truths that shaped its community. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a golden glow over the village green, Miss Marple sat on a bench beneath the ancient oak tree. Beside her was the small, now empty teacup, the one that had set these events in motion, resting carefully in her hands. She thought of human nature, of its capacity for kindness and cruelty, for secrets and revelations. She knew that little Wytham would continue to guard its stories, some forever untold, others whispered in quiet moments over tea and firesides. But she also knew this. Wherever there were people, there would be mysteries, and where there were mysteries, there would always be a Miss Marple, watchful, gentle, and unyielding in her pursuit of truth. As twilight settled gently over little Wytham, casting long shadows across the village green, Miss Marple sat quietly by the ancient oak tree, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The teacup, that fragile vessel, once a seemingly insignificant detail, lay beside her on the bench, its porcelain surface catching the fading light. The village had slowly begun to settle into a fragile peace, yet Miss Marple's mind was far from rested. There remained one final truth to unravel, one subtle thread to follow to its end. The discovery of Harold Sims's fragmented manuscript had peeled back layers of the village's genteel facade, exposing old wounds and simmering resentments. Violet Everleigh's desperate act, though grievous, was but the outward symptom of a far deeper malaise. Yet as the trial concluded and Violet faced her sentence, a question lingered. Who, beyond her, might have seen Harold's revelations as a threat worth silencing? Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Lydia Dawlish, whose frightened destruction of the manuscript had concealed a deeper fear. Lydia's earlier words, though given under duress, hinted at alliances and motives more complex than mere self-preservation. And there was one name that had remained curiously absent from the village gossip: Geoffrey Maltravers, the recently returned nephew of the late Lord Everleigh, whose sudden arrival before the tragedy had gone almost unnoticed amid the turmoil. It was to Geoffrey's modest cottage on the village's edge that Miss Marple now made her way, her steps measured and composed. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a man whose calm exterior masked an undercurrent of tension. "Miss Marple?" he greeted her, his voice smooth but guarded. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" She smiled gently. "I hoped we might speak, Geoffrey. There are loose ends that need tying, and your name has come to mind more than once." He gestured her inside, and they settled in the sitting room where sunlight filtered softly through lace curtains. Harold Sims's manuscript, Miss Marple began, was destined to expose certain truths that would not have been convenient for everyone. Geoffrey's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. "I understand your return was timely," she continued. "Lord Everleigh's passing left questions of inheritance, of family honor. A scandal could have cost you dearly." Geoffrey leaned forward slightly. "I came to protect the family legacy. Harold's writings threatened to tarnish it." Miss Marple nodded. "Protecting one's family is natural, Geoffrey. But how far would you go to ensure its reputation remained intact?" A shadow crossed his face, and for the first time he lost his composure. "The truth is dangerous," he said quietly. "Harold was reckless, and some things should have stayed buried." Miss Marple watched him carefully. It seems someone feared the manuscript enough to silence Harold. Violet Everleigh's act was desperate, but there was another hand in this. Geoffrey's eyes darted toward a small writing desk in the corner, where a folded piece of paper rested, almost inviting. Miss Marple rose and crossed to it, unfolding the note within. It was a letter, unsigned but unmistakably penned in Geoffrey's distinctive script, warning Harold to desist or face consequences. Confronted, Geoffrey's defenses crumbled. He confessed to confronting Harold the evening before the tea party, desperate to persuade him to abandon the manuscript. When Harold refused, words turned heated. Geoffrey claimed he left, unaware of Violet's tragic interference moments later. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "You sought to intimidate, but the fatal act was Violet's alone. Yet your actions, driven by fear and pride, set the stage for tragedy." Geoffrey bowed his head, the weight of his guilt settling upon him. "I never wished for death, only to protect my family." The delicate balance of justice was struck. Geoffrey was charged with coercion and intimidation, while Violet's sentence remained for manslaughter, a tragic reckoning of intentions and outcomes. As Miss Marple walked back through the quiet village streets, the final puzzle pieces fit into place. The teacup that didn't belong on the tray was not merely a vessel of poison, but a symbol of fear, loyalty, and the tangled web of human motives that so often underlie crime. In Little Witham, peace would return, fragile but genuine, tempered by the knowledge of what had been uncovered. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, would remain the guardian of its quiet truths, her sharp eyes and gentle heart ready to untangle the next mystery hidden just beneath the surface.